Hello YouTube, this is part 2 of the video series Sunni Islamic Jurisprudence. According to traditional Sunni Islam, uh, Imam Abu Hanifa, Imam Malik, Imam Shafi, and Imam Ahmad bin Hanbal uh, are the ones who are known as the four Imams. And in my last video, part 1, I think I talked about uh, I think it talked about how I would, you know, identify who the four imams were, and I think I forgot to do that, and so I do apologize. It just slipped in my mind. But yeah, whenever you hear the reference of four imams, or whenever you hear Sunni Muslims talking about the four imams or the the great four imams say this and that, or you know, the reference is always towards Imam Abu Hanifa, Imam Malik, Imam Shafi, and Imam Ahmad bin Hanbal. These four are the ones who are referred to as the four Imams. And so, according to traditional Sunni Islam, these four have a central role that Islamic scholars after them do not have. Now, why is this the case? To answer this question, we further dive into Mufti Muhammad Sajjad's Understanding Taqlid, following one of the four great Imams, second edition. And so, the greatness of the early scholars over those who came later. Of the early scholars over those who came later. Okay, once it is acknowledged that the layman must follow scholars, why is it that the four Imams and their schools alone are given preference over all other scholars? Firstly, all four Imams, Imams Abu Hanifa, Shafi, Malik, Ahmad, belong to that age and generation, or very close to it, in the case of Imam Ahmad, about which the Messenger of Allah testified as its being the best of this ummah. The Arabic word ummah means community, but in Islamic terminology it refers to the body of Muslim believers. He, again, the Prophet Muhammad, said, "The best of my ummah is my generation, then the generation after them, then the generation after them." Furthermore, the testimonies of the most erudite Sunni scholars for over 1,000 years leaves no doubt that these four men and their schools represent the most authentic, penetrating, and faithful understanding of the Holy Quran and Sunnah. No scholar of the later centuries has received the kind of unequivocal acclaim they did from the high caliber of scholars that they did. Thus, when it is accepted and obvious that the non-scholar is compelled to follow scholars for his deen, it is absurd to give preference to a scholar coming in the later centuries over one of these four great imams. Muslim scholars throughout the centuries right up to very recent times taught this point as an incontestable fact. Imam Ibn Rajab al-Hanbali, for example, was a great jurist and scholar respected by all schools. He lived in the 14th century when the levels of scholarship were incomparably above the situation we have today. He wrote two works presenting this as the view of the Ahlul Sunnah. Now, Ahlul Sunnah in Arabic means people of the Sunnah, and it is a term used in reference to the body of Sunni Muslims specifically, at least when Sunnis use it. Uh, His first book is entitled amazingly, unequivocally, Al-Rad ala man itaba غير al-Madahib al-Arba, which is Arabic for refutation of those who follow other than the four schools. And again, if I'm butchering any Arabic in this video, please do. And if you're a native Arabic speaker, please do forgive me. Anyways, back to the booklet. His second treatise is Bayan Fadl Ilm al-Salaf ala Ilm al-Khalaf, the exposition of the excellence of the knowledge of the predecessors over the knowledge of the successors. Both works have always been unquestioningly counted as the Imam's works and are easily available. One wonders what the classical Sunni scholars, such as Imam Ibn Rajab, would have said if they could see our state today, where we find the four schools being actively targeted and made to seem deviant, and where Muslims who are not Sharia experts and thus choose to rely on one of the four great Imams are maligned for doing so, and where people who do not accept the central role of the four schools dishonestly portray classical scholars like Imam Ibn Rajab as being against taqlid and like them not adherents of any of them. Although in the case of Ibn Rajab, his name is never mentioned except with the open declaration that he was a Hanbali. Sunni scholars practiced taqlid of the four schools. This leads us to another patent fact, namely that practically all the thousands of famous hadith scholars, muhaddithun, and jurists, fuqaha, of the Muslim Ummah for the last 1,000 years followed one of the four Imams, finding themselves compelled to submit to their awe-inspiring intellectual rigor and insight. This is a fact attested to by the most authoritative books of hadith criticism and Islamic history, such as Imam al-Dahabi's Sayyar Alam al-Nubula and the various other biographical compilations, Tabakat and Kutub al-Rijal. It is startling to find giants in Islamic scholarship, such as Imams Yahya bin Sa'id. See appendix for more on this. Imam Muhaddith, Ibn Hajar, Dahabi, Tahawi, Razi, Jassas, Nawawi, and the list goes on endlessly, all adhering to one of the four schools. Clearly, it is also a great testimony to the true humility and fear of Allah of these great men that despite their own towering statuses as muhaddithun and jurists, they were ready to admit that others had greater knowledge than themselves, and thus they followed them. Just as this speaks volumes about them and their real humility, it also reveals an alarming danger for any sincere Muslim concerning himself, namely if it was a mark of humility and the fear of Almighty Allah that compelled them to choose to follow one of the Imams, and surely rejecting taqlid of the Imams may be evidence of the pride lurking within a person. What else could lead a person to view him or herself competent enough to abandon taqlid and deduce their own laws despite being hindered by a long list of deficiencies, at the top of which is not being able to understand Arabic? Pride, however, is a disease that for the earnest believer cannot be tolerated at any expense. For the Messenger of Allah said, "A person with the extent of a grain of pride in his heart will not enter paradise." Can taqlid done by an erudite scholar be different from that of a layman? Yes. Again, in reading from Mufti Muhammad Sajjad's Understanding Taqlid, following one of the four great Imams, this time quoting from page 27, and I quote, Erudite scholars who were well grounded in the Islamic sciences did look at the evidences, and if they believed that the more correct position was different to that of the school, they would leave the school on that issue. This has also been termed ittiba, or following by evidence, by some people, but in reality it is still taqlid. The reason for this is that even if he is only following an imam with knowledge of the evidence, he looks at it through the lenses of the school of one of the four imams. That is, he does taqlid of them in their principles of interpretation, or called usul, i.e., he has not actually made his own principles, which will normally lead him to the same conclusion as his imam. For the layman, however, this level of research is normally beyond their capabilities. Moreover, nor is each believer required to become such a scholar, as that would have required everyone to end up virtually abandoning other worldly pursuits and occupations. The Sharia, on the contrary, does not demand of us that which is beyond our means. Allah Most High says, Allah does not burden any soul what it can bear. Surah Al-Baqarah, which is the second chapter of the Quran, as well as the longest one, verse 286. Hence, the duty of the common man is to simply follow true scholars as ordered in the verse in Surah Al-Anbiya, which is another chapter of the Quran, verse 7, unquote. The Prophet himself quoted in a hadith in Sahih Bukhari as saying the following words: Whoever God wishes good for, he grants him understanding of the religion. In commenting on the Prophet's words, here's what Mufti Muhammad Sajjad says. This, and I quote, this hadith clearly proves that Allah has favored some members of the community over others with the deep understanding of the deen. Thus, there are those who can be worthy of speaking on matters of the deen and those who are not. It is thus obvious that the unlearned will follow the learned. However, those who argue against following a madhab contradict the hadith, as they argue that all Muslims are equal in expertise and understanding, and on the basis of which they forbid all Muslims from following any person and instead call towards directly accessing the Quran and Sunnah without any medium, unquote. And it is this phenomenon of approaching the Quran and the Sunnah without a medium is what results in a literal interpretation of religious texts, which then produces things like radical Islam and Islamophobia. Hanafi fiqh on jihad. Quoting from Ahmad al-Daoudi's The Islamic Law of War, Justifications and Regulations, pages 78 to 79, and I quote, the reason for jihad in the Hanafi's view, is كَوْنُهُمْ حَرْبَ عَلَيْنَا, literally, they're being at war against us, unquote. Meaning, according to the Hanafi view, fighting is only allowed in Hanafi reasoning when Muslims, when non-Muslims or the enemy enters a state of war in the first place, and then Muslims are to respond to that. So it is not Muslims who initiate war themselves. It has to be the other side first that initiates the war, and the Muslims are only to respond militarily in self-defense. Moving on to the second point, al-Sarakhsi and al-Shaybani. Now, al-Shaybani is known as the father of Muslim international law, and he was one of the two greatest students of Imam Abu Hanifa. And Both al-Sarakhsi and al-Shaybani state that, and I again quote from Ahmad al-Dawudi's book, although kufr, unbelief in God, is one of the greatest sins, it is between the individual and his God, the Almighty, and the punishment for this sin is to be postponed to the Dar al-Jaza, the abode of reckoning, the hereafter, unquote. So, I mean, again, it is not up to Muslims to punish unbelievers. You know, it's an issue entirely left to God. Now, my issue with Ahmad al-Dawoodi translating kufr as unbelief in God is, um, according to Islam, in Islamic terminology, kufr, the Arabic word kufr, does not mean unbelief in God specifically, but means unbelief, and it includes not only unbelief in God, it includes not only unbelief in God, but also includes other forms of unbelief that would prevent a person from being considered a believer according to Islam. For example, if a person believes in God and does not believe that the Prophet of Islam is a true prophet, then he or she would be considered an unbeliever according to Islam. However, in this context, it could be that al-Shaybani is speaking in reference to a specific kufr, and this could be the reason why al-Dawoodi translated kufr as specifically unbelief in God. Maybe. Um, Anyways, additional information about al-Shaybani that I would like to provide is that he was an eminent jurist of the Hanafi school and the one who wrote the first major Sunni treatise on the law of nations, which has been translated with extensive commentary by the late Iraqi-born academic Majid Khadouri, titled The Islamic Law of Nations. And speaking of Majid Khadouri, here's some info from his The Law of Islamic Nations. Uh, so, and I quote, "We have seen how Abu Hanifa and his disciples, especially Shaybani, laid down general rules and principles governing Islam's external relations based on the assumption that a normal state of war existed between Islamic and non-Islamic territories. But they made no explicit statements that the Jihad was a war to be waged against unbelievers solely on account of their disbelief. Kufr. On the contrary, the early Hanafi jurists seem to have stressed that tolerance should be shown unbelievers, especially scriptuaries, and advised the Imam to prosecute war only when the inhabitants of the Darul Harb came into conflict with Islam." Unquote. Going back to Ahmad al-Dawoodi's Islamic Law of War, Justifications and Regulations, starting from the last paragraph of page 80. However, as Khadouri rightly points out, Abu Hanifa and his students, including al-Shaybani, formulated their rules of international law on the assumption that a state of war existed between the Islamic and non-Muslim states. It is important to add here that this assumption was based on an interpretation of the Islamic sources, but was not based on an interpretation of the Islamic sources, but on the reality of their current situation. In fact, a state of war in the absence of a peace treaty characterizes the pattern of international relations during the periods in which Islam emerged. In the words of John L. Esposito, the classical Muslim jurists formulated the Islamic law of war in a world where war was the natural state. Abdullahi Ahmad an-Naim also notes the first 3 centuries of Islam was an extremely harsh and violent environment. Where the use of force in intercommunal relations was the unquestioned norm. In the words of Sherman A. Jackson, a prevailing state of war rather than difference of religion was the raison d'etre of jihad. Furthermore, Khalid Yahya Blankenship adds that a pattern of a permanent state of war had existed throughout history. For example, he writes, the Assyrians, like the Romans under the Republic, used to take to the field every year against someone. Frequently, if a treaty did not exist, a state of war was assumed. Even the United States and its allies in modern times have preferred a policy of obtaining the unconditional surrender of the enemy where possible, as in the Second World War. The Maliki Fiqh and Jihad, again from Ahmad al-Dawoodi's book, The Islamic War, Law of War, Justification and Regulations. On page 80, we find that Imam Malik's position on warfare in Islam was that jihad was only a defensive warfare. Now the Shafi fiqh on jihad. Now that's where things get a bit spicy, and you shall see why. Um, I'm going to conclude part 2 of this video. I will resume and start from this slide in part 3. Hope you guys enjoyed part 1 and 2 so far, and I hope that you guys also enjoy part 3. Anyways, uh, get ready for part 3.